You are listening to Within Tolerance, a podcast for machinists by machinists. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson of Protein Machining, and this week I am very happy to welcome the team from Arda Cards. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
So go ahead, introduce yourselves. Who are you? What you do? Big picture. What is Arda Cards?
Yeah, well, first, I appreciate you having us on. I mean, I had reached out originally just because I guess it's rare to find a chunk of a business you can kind of peel off and automate that doesn't cost like $70,000 to do so. So in building Arda Cards, which we'll get into, I think we kind of figured out like, oh, this is really a powerful tool and maybe would be very useful to a bunch of other businesses. So thought I'd reach out, and you really appreciate you having us on. So my background,
you gave me the demo, so
oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, who are you? So we know one of you we've had on before. One of you is brand new. Who are you guys? And basically, what is Arda Cards?
So I'm Uriel from Austere Manufacturing, now Arda Cards as well. My background, I studied industrial design, grew up building things my whole life, worked on some highlights would be like lunar landers, spacesuits, a bunch of robotic boats, and then got into, through the spacesuit stuff, got into manufacturing high-end buckles, and that's Austere Manufacturing. Through Austere Manufacturing, had a lot of challenges with kind of growing a hardware business, and started using Kanban about 3 years ago, started a podcast sort of about that journey of lean called Incremental. And then in using Kanban as our reordering mechanism, found a bunch of basically just logistical problems with it that were very solvable. Found out like Toyota has a software backend, and that's kind of how this whole thing started with Arda Cards. Kyle and I started a company years ago together, and we've been friends ever since. I think we share I don't know if it's always like a productive passion for efficiency and automation. Like sometimes you spend a lot of time, developing something where you could have just done the thing. But so we were talking about it over the years. And anyway, so Kyle's background fit perfectly into this.
So, and I'm happy to introduce myself. So I'm Kyle. I'm probably one of the weird non-manufacturing people you'll have on the podcast. My background is that I started Rorus with Uriel, and then we kind of went our separate career ways, and I went into something totally different than lunar landers and spacesuits, which was consulting for private equity funds. So I worked on maybe 50 or 75 transactions over 6 or so years, decided that career path wasn't super for me, and then pivoted 100% into a sales role, selling to hospitals. Totally different. And that is what kind of, along with the sort of unhealthy love for Excel I developed in my private equity career, led to me getting really into a lot of these low-code, no-code platforms, which started off Arda. And so when I heard Uriel talking about some of the challenges he was facing implementing Kanban, I was like, dude, you are in the black and white part of the infomercial, like screaming up to the skies, there must be a better way. It was like, there has to be a better way. And, we, originally developed the first version of the system. It was super clunky, super, super difficult to use, and kind of went back and forth until really solved a couple of your biggest pain points. And now, we've been a company for a few months, and everything, every time we go back and forth with the product, it gets both simpler and more powerful, which is awesome. And I think we're solving a solid problem.
Awesome. Well, so for anybody who wants to hear more of Uriel's backstory, he's been on episode 109 and 175. And let's get into what is Arda. What is it like, for those who haven't listened to Incremental, which I would be surprised if that's, a majority or a minority in this listenership, but what is Kanban? Why do I want it? And then what does Arda solve with that?
Yeah. So I think broadly, every business, I can't think of an exception, has items that they want to keep in stock to run their business. And if you're just doing software, that might be like trash bags and cleaning products for your office. And if you're in like banking, that's, more office supplies. But for most of the listeners here, it's manufacturing. So even more so, right? So it's like all that stuff for cleaning your bathroom, but then it's all the stuff for creating your product. Or if you're a job shop, maybe the product changes drastically, but there's still a lot of supplies that we like to keep in stock. So actually, we've sort of broken out supplies in a business into 3 categories. One is stuff you always want in stock. Second category is sort of stuff where you don't necessarily, every time you use it, you're picking out of a few options. So like maybe 3 options. And then the last are just really one-off orders you're going to want to place. And those tend to get lumped all together in the minds of business owners and teams where it's like someone's just in charge of ordering writ large. But category 1 is actually really easy to automate, right? And so people are spending, from what we've seen and talking to a lot of different companies, it seems to be about 20% of the team's time is actually dealing with ordering, managing inventory, but then a big chunk of it is inefficiency related to not having what you need when you need it. So that's like, oh, that thing didn't arrive that we need to do our work today. Okay, let's do a quick group huddle and go like, what are we going to produce today? And then maybe we'll kick that over to next week because that will be here in time for next week. And in the meantime, we can get X, Y, and Z done. And that is really typical across teams. And whether that's a 5-minute conversation of like, oh, hey, sorry, I haven't purchased that yet. So why don't you hold off and do this thing instead? To, I mean, we just did an install on a company that, had significant communication across the team around the logistics of where are the things we need when we need them. And it's something that fades, much like most waste we encounter in a business, sort of fades into the background. You get used to it. But yeah, it's just, it eats up a ton of time for companies and teams. People kind of don't realize it. And it's very simple to fix, I would say.
And Kanban is, I'll probably the least qualified person to explain it. So I'll probably do the simplest job. This was new to me. It's basically a system Toyota implemented that you can take an index card or some card of some kind, write out all the stuff about the supply it's related to on that card, stick it between, the nth and n+1 supply, like 20th and 21st out of your stack of 100, such that the card, when pulled, triggers an order as you organically deplete the supply. And then that card has all the info you need to order on it. And then you stick it back in between the 20th and 21st whenever you get your replenishment. So it's just an easy way to stay on top of your inventory. I probably did a bad job explaining that.
Well, I think at its base, its definition is signal, right? Or signboard or something like that.
Yeah.
So I mean, it makes sense. And
yeah.
Well, I was going to say, like, it's not just a business problem either. Like this whole reordering thing. I mean, it's big enough that Amazon had like those dash buttons. Like this is a human living in the modern world problem. And it's just exceptionally, so for a business.
Yeah. And I think the thing people fall into is that with computers, there's a temptation to gather more data than you actually can sort of practically use. And so that sort of brings up ERPs, right? ERPs are the classic solution to this problem. The problem is they create a lot of work. And unless someone is doing all that work, they are sometimes worse than useless. And sometimes, I mean, they have their place, to be clear. But Toyota uses Kanban still with a digital backend for a reason. They are one of the most
blew
efficient.
My mind.
Yeah, they're one of the most efficient businesses out there. And so maybe they don't realize something about ERPs that everyone else is getting, or maybe there's like very good reason for the way they're doing it. But yeah, fundamentally, you take a card, you tuck it into your inventory so that anyone in the shop, as you're depleting the inventory, when you get to the card, you pull it, that signals for a reorder. The amount of stuff you have behind the card is meant to be a sufficient supply for that resupply to come in. So like, let's say it takes a week to get more parts. You might have a week and a half of supply behind your Kanban card or order card. And that basically just makes the business run like that supply essentially becomes sort of an infinite supply in the business. So no one has to worry about it. And it only gets reordered as needed. And then a really cool aspect that we're sort of starting to unlock now in my shop is you can start to make a real plan for how you handle your items. So another place we're seeing a lot of waste is everyone's kind of improvising all the time, right? So if you need to order, I don't know, coolant, let's say, for your CNC, and you're like, it's really annoying when we run out. Why don't we order 3 5-gallon buckets instead of the one we normally order? That way we'll just have more. Firstly, ordering more of something only puts off the problem of running out, right? It doesn't solve it because it's not building a mechanism.
Right. And it very often makes it harder to remember where you got it when that larger supply runs out.
So where you got it, but also when it comes in, it's like, oh, we actually only have space for one. And so now what people do is either it's cluttering up the shop because they never really created a spot for 3 buckets, right? They only created a spot for one, or they tuck it in like their office somewhere or like the back of the shop somewhere. And then that bucket runs out. No one really realizes it's back there. So best case scenario is you're running around being like, hey, where did you put that other pail? I thought, I thought we bought 3 this last time. Do you know where those went? And then there's a whole bunch of communication around where they went. Where really fundamentally, if you just made the ordering process simpler and designated on the card, when you run out or when you're down to 1 bucket, order 1 more bucket. Now you get to plan your shop really carefully where it's like, okay, we're designating a spot for the bucket we're pulling from. And then we're also designating a spot for the bucket that comes in the mail. And so now everyone knows how that system works. When someone receives it, it has a place to go. We've been in like warehouses and stuff where there's just piles all over the place because like really talented employees are spending time solving stupid problems, right? It's like, oh, this pallet came in. There isn't room on the shelf where that supply goes. So I'm going to stick it back here and then I will move it. Yeah, whatever. It's like, it becomes a mess and eats up a ton of people's time.
Well, and it's funny, you've always been talking about lean, like the first couple times you were on the podcast, and I thought it was very interesting because for the longest time I was like, this is cool, but like, I don't understand why you're so obsessed with it. And then when I visited you, I was like, oh, like you need to do this. Like you have like the perfect microcosm of like where this really matters because your shop is so small.
Yeah.
And like now that I've grown in size with my own shop, I can see how when you have these terrible tendencies, they like get so much more amplified with the more space you have. You're like walking across the shop a million times because things are not well laid out. And, it's nice to handle them when you're small, but like, yeah, you might be reaching across the aisle to grab something. And now you're like, oh, I'm walking 10 times across the shop a day to go grab this thing that should be stocked here or needs a different home, or I need to split up my orders so that I have more of them. Like it's really opened my eyes, I think, to why it is so important now that I'm starting to see these issues in my own shop.
Yeah. I mean, I would say
one of the,
you go.
I was just going to say one of the funny concepts about walking across the shop and back and forth and stuff is Uriel told me to start saying non-value add, non-value add, non-value add every time I'm doing non-value add activity. And so things like walking across the shop, muttering to myself, hey, my customer wouldn't want to pay for this. If I said, hey, do you want to pay an extra 10 cents for me to walk back and forth across the shop floor 3 times to make this? They'd probably say no, right? So saying to yourself, non-value add, non-value add, non-value add. And I've like caught myself muttering that around my home, like being like walking to the front of my apartment, being like non-value add, non-value add. I should relay out my kitchen maybe.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I think it's a bit of
why don't you guys go for it?
A bit of a bug for sure, and like sometimes a little nonsensical, but I think overall it tends to bring you in the direction of running your business more efficiently, which I think like globally, maybe 50 years ago we could afford to have a lot of waste, but now with international trade, I think like as a small business or medium business, if you're not striving for efficiency, like the US has some disadvantages when it comes to running a business, it also has advantages, and you kind of need to be very efficient with people's time to be competitive. And so I think it's very important. As it relates to sort of Arda and Arda Cards, one of the inefficiencies I started noticing, we launched a new product a belt and increased our orders pretty significantly. And you visited our shop, Dylan, so we didn't really have the luxury of being like, all right, well, we'll just order more of everything when we order it and just store it. So we had to increase how many times we were ordering. And so it became very clear that our ordering methods were really bad. So I implemented Kanban about 3 years ago, just Sharpie on index cards, and then had this journey of trying to make the actual, so that takes care of like the information gathering, right? What do we need to order when, right? When you trigger a card, it goes in a bin that says to order, but you still have to order it. It may sound obvious, but what started happening is I'd have a pile of Kanban or order cards that weren't getting ordered because I was really busy, and then we'd still run out of stuff, embarrassingly, because I had just been like, oh, I'll get to it tomorrow or something. And that's when I started looking at like, how can we make this process more efficient? So we started adding QR codes to them. So we'd go in QR code generator, make a QR code to the Amazon link, or then I went down this whole rabbit hole of trying to get an email into a QR code, which I spent about a week on. It's probably a solvable problem. It is not easy, and it doesn't solve all the problems you want. And that's sort of where Kyle came in. So like these low code, no code platforms are super awesome. I would argue that Kyle sort of made it into a code platform. I mean, some of these, anyway, the features get pretty intense and awesome. And so that the two problems I approached Kyle with initially were creating the cards. So I didn't like, I got tired of the arts and crafts project, right? Like, write on a card with a Sharpie, make a QR code, stick it to it. And so that was one, is just like efficiently creating cards. The second were email reorders. So any vendor who only takes emails, writing those emails is a hassle. And so those were kind of the two.
Yeah, and those were kind of the things that I had experience with. So when I was in my kind of sales role building the CRM, email outreach was just a huge part of my job. And emailing people with contextual and like specific information about what they were, essentially that related specifically to their business was something I spent a ton of time learning how to automate, because we had maybe the worst CRM I've ever encountered. And I think my breaking point with it was I was asked to run a promotion where I emailed all of our current customers about a discount we were offering on a product, and I could not use the CRM to pull a list of our current customers. And that took about a week to get all of that information out of everybody's heads.
That's wild. That's like
I know.
One of the key features of a CRM.
I think it puts the C in CRM, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly.
I don't know how to M the R's without a list of the C's. And so, yeah. And so I was like, all right, that's it. And I built initially a really complicated spreadsheet, Excel-based platform, and then quickly realized that you can make once you switch to one of these low-code, no-code platforms, you can use all the same logic and you can integrate to so many other platforms. And that was like a huge unlock for me. And ultimately, what was just like a list of our customers grew and grew and grew until it became a list of a CRM, where I could push a button and email 80 people, with like actual contextual specific information that changed based on whether or not they were a customer, on where they were in the, in the country, things like that. And so when Uriel was struggling with email reorders, I was like, I got you. I can do this. And then, we kind of put our heads together, figured out a few kind of automation unlocks, like emailing, like gathering items from one vendor into a cart and then placing an order for that vendor on a specific day. So that was kind of one thing. And then, printing out the color-coded cards with the QR codes was the other kind of really big unlock as well. And then
we've gone 20 minutes without talking about the product. Why don't you paint a picture for the audience? What, besides just cards, because you guys gave me a demo to give the audience a backstory, and I thought it was super cool, because I am also maybe have been burned by poor ERP implementations at past jobs. And so I have a very sour taste in my mouth of those. And seeing what you guys have put together made me very excited, because it solved a few key pain points that I do have, reordering and sending emails and all this stuff. And I thought it was a very slick and nice implementation. So give us the rundown of the features and, what somebody could expect in a demo or, getting a license or subscription to Arda.
Yeah, 100%. So basically we built the product to do three things. The first is create and print your order cards. And so there's just a really nice way to create color-coded cards with information about your vendors, about your orders, any notes that you have, and where things go. Those can be printed off to, index cards, to full 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, really whatever fits your use case best. Then the second thing was placing the order. So we've kind of talked about that a decent amount, but you can scan these QR codes that are on the cards. They bring you back into the system, and then you can action the kind of QR code or the supply that you've scanned in various ways, depending on how you get the item. And you can either, click a button, go to the website, place the order there. You can add something to your cart to place an email order. And it kind of just takes care of all the ways in which you get things. You can build shopping lists and gradually check things off as they're in your, say, a physical shopping cart you're pushing around a store. And then finally, because we're keeping all of those records of the things that you've ordered, since you're doing it through the system, we realized that there was another big opportunity to create a receiving workflow where when things come in, and this is kind of the third thing we do, when things come in, you can essentially monitor, then to make sure you got everything you ordered, basically. So that integrates with shipping providers, so you can add a tracking number and get live updates, and kind of a bunch of cool features like that. But ultimately, it's those three things: creating and printing cards, placing orders, and then making sure you get what you ordered and receiving everything. So that's pretty much Arda in a nutshell.
And one really important,
which is awesome,
North Star for us through the whole process was, though it's very powerful, we didn't want it to require every field be filled. So I think a big issue of implementing these systems is kind of like, I don't know, like we talked about, like eating an elephant, right? You have to do it one bite at a time. So if you create a card, we made sure, and this took many iterations to make it still powerful and function like a database, but also allow you to basically just put a title in and maybe where you're going to order, or maybe even not, right? You think, oh, I need to buy some Windex. I don't know where I'm going to order that, and I don't really want to have to think about that right now. So I'm just going to type out like Windex. I'm going to make that card. And then the really cool thing about these cards is they have a QR code that brings you back into the database. And so once you're sitting down in front of your computer, you can actually just, fill it in once you find your best deal on Windex. So that was really important to us. And like similarly, if you don't have a receiving workflow right now, and you don't really want to do receiving, there's a toggle like, to include or not include an item in the receiving workflow. So a lot of this was really built to not add a tremendous amount of work to busy business owners. We're trying to take away work. But then as you want more powerful systems, they are available. And I would say like one of Kyle's strong suits is definitely making, you said this to me, Kyle, like when you started, is like the data should be a happy accident of doing your work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And not like a huge task, like your CRM experience.
Yeah. So like, this was a huge issue with our CRM, was like every time I sent an email, I was supposed to record that email into the CRM, copy and paste it, and like separately do a whole record keeping task. And as I went through and created more features in, this CRM platform that I built for myself, I realized that I was doing such a more diligent job with record keeping because it was a happy accident of another enabling workflow that I've made for myself, which was like generating these emails. And so because I was sending them through the platform, the record keeping just flowed from that automatically and wasn't its own separate task. And so I think that was another big unlock for us as we went through with Arda.
That was one of the things that stuck out to me in the demo you gave me, was that it was very flexible. And I think that that's a thing that is missing from most ERP demos that I've gotten. They'll say, oh, to do an order, you do this, and then you do this, and then you add in your material certs and this and this and this. And it's like, well, okay, my customer doesn't care about material certs. What if I don't want to skip that? And they kind of look at you like, well, you got to put something in
make a
there. Like, what are
PDF.
you, what are you talking about? And like, that's what I loved about your demos. It's just like, oh, I don't want to do receiving. Okay, just don't do it. And like, and you told me, you're like, oh yeah, if you want to eventually, all the data is there and you can just pick it up and start doing it. And it's like, okay, that's cool. Cause sometimes I get lazy or sometimes I'm too busy to do stuff. And like, those are the kind of things that lead to ERPs just failing, is people not having the time to do every little button click. And then it's like, oh, nobody's put in any data for runtime for 6 months now because it sucks. And it's like, okay, so now it's useless.
Right. Yeah. And that we ran into that. And at my old job, ultimately we sunset the CRM that we had in favor of the thing that like I kind of cobbled together. And we realized that no one but me had logged in for 6 months. And I was the one who was like actually, building this other platform. So I have the least cause to log in, if that makes sense. So, yeah. And so it was just a very like, record keeping should be a happy accident of other enabling workflows. And, we've definitely run into a bunch of customers who are almost hesitant to put in, like, say, their storage locations because they're like, oh, well, we have shelves 1, 2, 3, and 4, and, we want to designate columns A, B, C, and D. We were like, if people just know it as like the left side of the big shelf, like, just write that if that's like what you have right now, and people will know what that means.
Yeah, you're like a team of smart people. So, like, it's like, well, we'd love to organize our whole shop. It's like, yeah, wouldn't we all? But
yeah. We're not all bin picking robots from Amazon. Like exactly. Left side of the shelf is good enough. I can figure that out. So going back to the cards, then they're all QR code based now. So you scan them if you want to reorder stuff from, let's say, McMaster. I can scan a handful of cards and it'll create one email for all of those part numbers. Or how does that work? Is there carts that it creates for different vendors? So
I would say the cart, like Kanban, just the physical cards are great. They get the signal, but then processing the signal is a really nice power up that Arda kind of brings to the table. And emails are a great example of that. So exactly what you said, like as you're scanning throughout the week or throughout, every day you could place an order, whatever you're feeling, and you can sort of set a lot of that up in Arda. Of when those emails go out, but basically you're adding stuff to the cart as you're using it, just scanning add to cart. And then at some point you go into your cart and you click a button for, let's say, a McMaster item. And if you're submitting orders to McMaster through email, it's going to roll all of those items up with how many you wanted to order, which is designated on your card, into one email with taxable status built in, on-off toggle. That's something you set ahead of time. And then that's just going to create a draft email for you with the click of a button that includes everything you want in the quantities you want, any vendor notes you want to add in there. And then you can automate the sending of that email. So like once you're comfortable that it's working well for you, you just set it to go out every Thursday, let's say, right? So like when I order aluminum for Austere, I submit those orders on Thursday so they can come in Tuesday. And so that's automated. So that's rolling up everything we need from that vendor. That email is fully editable. So you can just go in there and say like, hey, I hope the kids are well, or, whatever else, or, try to get the order right this time, whatever details you want to add. So kind of like click of a button, it's going to send that email for you. And
what
then
about
online orders?
Something I missed.
Yep.
This is something I missed asking you in my demo. What about, like, specifically McMaster for me? We typically are ordering almost every day. And is there a way to set a notification or something of like, hey, last shipment for the day is coming up. Do you want to send your email? Or like, how does it deal with like,
interesting,
could I just set up a McMaster email every single day? And if there's nothing there, it doesn't send it. And then if there is something there, it auto sends it before the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have that automation built in. So the same way Uriel's goes out on Thursdays, you can set it to be daily. You can set it to be monthly with minimum number of days for the thing to be in the cart. And you can set any day of the week. So you can set Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, or just the end of every day, or immediately. So if something gets added to the cart, it just immediately triggers that email to go out. And so you don't actually even have to go through the separate step of creating and setting the email, aggregating the orders in your cart if it's important enough where you're like, oh, we got to place that order.
They don't charge for shipping
yeah. So that's also possible.
Okay.
And then
awesome. Yeah.
the online orders are kind of similar. Right now, we don't integrate directly with websites. So email orders are really convenient where they're possible, but where they're not possible, I mean, if you're ordering from Amazon, let's say, I'm sure we've all been there where you thought you ordered the same item, but it arrived and it turned out you hadn't found the same listing as last time. That happened to me with padded envelopes. And so you end up like scrolling through your previous purchases to find, to find the exact listing, and that's all time consuming. So with this click of a button, it's going to open all the links you want to order from that vendor, and then you just go through and add them to your cart on Amazon or Zorro or whatever your vendor is, and check out there. And that
That's
still
super cool.
saves a bunch of time there.
Totally. Let's see. From the Patreon, Kevin Blodgett asked, how do you deal with shipping minimums when restocking small quantities and shipping costs? So I think that this is both a kind of lean Kanban question in general, and then how does Arda deal with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think it deals with it well. No. It basically.
All right, question done. On to the next.
Onwards. No, so there's a few questions in there. I think largely, that's a thing we do handle. Like Arda, you can set up to do a bunch of different ways. But I would say broadly, it's very easy to see the costs of shipping, and it's very hard to see the costs of basically having a poorly managed inventory and reordering system. And so if you're kind of like, if you're a vendor who, say you get flat rate shipping on something, and so you're like, wow, it would be great if we sort of aggregated all our orders from the month into one order. That's fine. You can do that. You can set that up in Arda. It will handle that nicely. What you sort of want to ask yourself, though, is how much money are you saving there? And have you used expediting or overnight shipping recently? Because whatever you were doing there, maybe take some of that budget and allocate it to just more ongoing ordering in a consistent and planned manner, because there's a ton of downstream savings from not bulk ordering your stuff. But that's just a judgment you have to make for yourself, depending on the supply, depending on the supplier, how responsive they are, how quick the lead times are, how much the shipping is, right? Are we talking you don't want to pay $10 when you could combine the order and right? Or are we talking like $500 or $1,000? So it really depends. But yeah, there's a cost, and you can easily calculate this cost. There's a cost to warehousing your stuff in your shop, right? What are you paying for space? And then there's also a cost, as it turns out, to having more stuff in your shop, because it means walking further to get everything. And walking is about a penny a step, if you want to, or more. So like there's all these hidden costs to doing business the normal way. But the added cost of shipping is very apparent, and these other costs are sort of not that apparent. So I would say in general, we've found it way better to just systemize this stuff and let it run. But we do sometimes aggregate for vendors that are expensive shipping. Like one example is the tubes that we ship the belt in. If we order 6 boxes at a time, they are significantly cheaper, like out of our price point if we don't, and then we can afford it if we do. So we are ordering a lot at a time. And so, but the real cost there is they're a bulky item for us to store. We have a tiny shop. And so we are bound, like that is a real cost as well. Like what else could we be doing with that space, So sort of a balance, and having it just run itself means you're not talking about it between team members and all this other stuff. So yeah, I would say my answer is essentially, those shipping costs seem high, but they're often a lot lower than the amount of money being wasted in the team. But Arda does handle it if you want.
Yeah. We did have a customer who was paying $500 flat rate shipping, whether they ordered, 20 of this item or one. And I think it was about $1,000 item. So, that was one instance where we were like, okay, it definitely does make sense to prioritize being at least a little bit efficient with these savings. But the way to do that is to just set a high or minimum. And so you basically say, hey, whenever we order, we're going to order 8 of these. That means we're going to need to get down to 3 or 4 rather than 1 or 2, because we're going to wait kind of longer between our orders. So that's kind of the other mechanism you can use to do that.
Okay. I think that's totally fair. Let's see. Ethan Patain, another past guest, said Kanban is awesome and certainly helps promote proper lean practices, but where do you draw the line? When does it all become too much? And then how do you incite new employees to uphold practices and make them care about keeping your business intact?
That's a juicy one.
It is.
So,
yeah, it was kind of interesting where you draw the line. Uriel and I were just talking about this the other day, and I think you alluded to this early on. We're maybe sometimes a little too into efficiency, where it's like, I got a new credit card recently where I can just put my subway rides on it automatically. Like it'll go to a different default, and that's 5% cash back on my subway rides. And I realized I spend like $30 a month on the subway, and I have a 2% cash back credit card. So like that's 3% on $30 is like really maybe not worth having another credit account, but
efficiency.
Yeah. I think I wouldn't draw the line. I mean, there is no line. I think the line is what is the real bottleneck in your business, right? Like, I don't think that just myopically pursuing Kanban, for example, is necessarily a good use of everyone's time. In my experience has been over the past 3 years, is your focus keeps shifting based on your awareness of what waste looks like in your business, and also what the biggest problems are that you're handling. And so I think there is always room for improvement. And time again, if you just look at different companies who have done this, there isn't a reason, like businesses that pursue continuous improvement make more money. So, and I think the problem is that any rational person is not going to start, because for the first 3 months, it's only costing you money, right? You're spending a bunch of time on something that is not directly making you money. But over, depending how you tweak the numbers of like how many minutes you're spending on improvement compared to how much time that's going to save you every day, by year 3, you're going to be like 3 years ahead of where you would have been. So I don't know why you draw a line to sort of, cap yourself there. I know for my business, we're around 600% improvement in production. That's, there's a lot in that, investing in automation of different types. But I think broadly, there's a lot of systems. I'm sure you talk about this all the time, like pallet pools, robots, all the fancy cool stuff that you go to IMTS to see. That's all pursuing efficiency, nominally. Right? I mean, they're really cool also, and we all want them, but,
well, yeah,
there's that. And it turns out that there's just a lot of cheaper places to improve your business. So, I mean, people might know this already, but in self-reporting, people tend to say that they spend about 85% of their time in their day on value-add activities. In audits, that tends to be flipped. So it's typically 15% on value add and 85% non-value add. That can be demoralizing, but it can also be kind of exciting, because typically improving your non-value add activities is really cheap, right? Like when you're walking around the building looking for where did the printer toner go, or like, did we get any more in and it just didn't make it to the printer, or do we have to order more in? That's a very easy problem to solve. You don't have to spend $70,000 and get a UR robot to solve that problem. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And I think Kanban and inventory management, like what we're realizing is that is an easy chunk of the business to sort of peel away from having. It's often the founders or like top employees who are handling this stuff, and just freeing people up to do other things. In terms of the culture side of it, of getting people to continue I don't know, upholding your business or keeping your business together. That is a cultural thing. I don't see, I mean, there's interviews with lots of people who have a lot more employees, and when people make a shift to continuous improvement and lean, like there are going to be a couple people in any team who just aren't into it. Everyone else, it radically increases retention, right? Everyone loves problem solving, and it's so cool to be empowered to sort of make your own life better all the time. And so people don't tend to get bored of it. I think generally it is a very hard thing to stay on top of systems, even for myself in my own business, right? You set up a system, like you write an SOP. Are you referencing the SOP? Like, it's just hard. I don't know. I don't think there's an answer there, but I think we just keep trying and keep improving. Maybe you improve how the SOP is displayed. Maybe you add a QR code to make it really easy to jump back into the SOP to edit it and update it. Yeah, I think once you sort of get everyone thinking about waste all the time and get everyone thinking about leverage, like something I've been thinking about a lot lately is leverage. How much, like when you're doing something in your business, is that a zero leverage activity or does it have leverage? And the more leverage you as the founder can bring to the business, the better, and the more time across the organization that people are spending on higher leverage activities, the better. And so like, what is leverage? It's kind of like if I'm ordering rubber gloves from Amazon, that has no leverage, right? Or maybe has a slight amount because you use the rubber gloves to make like a lot of product that you sell, but generally it has no leverage. You're ordering an item, that item has been ordered. That's it. On the other hand, if you take an extra 5 minutes to set up a system so that no one ever has to sort of take 5 minutes from their day to order rubber gloves, that is a high leverage activity. Similarly, systemizing anything in your business is a high leverage activity, and actually running your business is a very low leverage activity. And so it's obviously a balance because you need money. So like if you, Dylan, stopped programming parts, right, that would not be good for cash flow. However,
right.
The time you took to, I mean, you've talked a lot about like paperless parts, right? The time you took to sort of look at that, find a good solution, implement it, do all the work that it took, like that saves a ton of time. So that's a much higher leverage activity. And I think it's very easy to slip into a mode, especially as you're scaling, where you're only sort of executing on stuff. You're not improving how that stuff happens. And that can be hiring, inventory management, programming CNCs, you know, all of it. There's always room to improve the systems.
So maybe a better rephrasing of that question is, at what point are you spending too much time on an improvement? Like, I think that the reason he probably is asking that is that I think we've all seen the overuse of lean, and like you'll see someone who's like, I spent all week designing and 3D printing this fancy like window cleaning solution for my CNCs so I can see in it. And you're like, yeah, that's 10 seconds with a squeegee and Windex. Like,
right.
You know, what signals to you a good investment in time in an improvement versus buying something off the shelf, or, you know, just realizing that like, you know, that 5 seconds is not worth 10 days of improvement.
So I think this is where like time horizon is really important to start thinking about. Like, what is your time horizon for when these things should pay off? Because if you said that like we're going to use that improvement for 1,000 years, then maybe saving 5 seconds in 10 days makes sense. If our time horizon is a little shorter than that, then some of those don't make a ton of sense. The way we do it in our shop is we have a board on the wall where we write different ideas, and then we have impact and we have cost, right? And cost is sort of time and money, and impact is sort of, I don't know. It could be ease, it could be time, it could be reduction in rejects. So it's sort of still a kind of a soft metric. You know, obviously we could break that out into 5 different sliders, but we don't bother. And then you just slap it up there, and then you can just work your way down at a diagonal, right? And you're trying to get low cost, high impact improvements. I think if you increase your time horizon just slightly, you realize that actually improving things and seeing waste is a skill, and skills don't just pop into existence. You need to practice. And so I am 3 years in, and I think I'm getting much better at having a good nose for sort of like how to go about it. There's also books about how to go about it. Designing the Future is one that comes to mind. It's sort of about how to improve your design process to reduce rework and to front load essentially, developing a very good understanding of what your actual problem is and the root causes, because a lot of improvements are operational rather than process. So for example, you're at your CNC and you're like, oh man, this would be way faster if I got an impact driver or whatever to tighten my bolts, right? And this is a real example from my CNC. Then I read SMED by Shigeo Shingo, and one of the chapters is on reducing the number of fasteners. And so I looked at the jaws and I was like, they have 4 bolts per jaw, but it's always clamping in one direction. So only 2 of those bolts are coming into play. So I eliminated 2 bolts from all the jaws. And so you just cut your time in half without spending essentially any money. And so, yeah, I think just generally, or another example is I was looking at a $15,000 tumbler, because tumbling was a real bottleneck for us. It was 2 hours of tumbling and a cheap Harbor Freight tumbler. Looking at a $15,000 tumbler, that would probably bring that down to 30 minutes of tumbling. Sorry, $15,000 item. And then I was talking to Alec White at White Industries, and he was like, "You're sandblasting your parts, right?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "That's a pretty common way of deburring." He's like, "Why are you tumbling?" I was like, "Why am I tumbling?" So went back, did some experiments. I increased the amount of time we're sandblasting, and we eliminated tumbling. And so that I wouldn't have been in the position to even see that if we didn't take time every day to think hard about like, what are we doing? Where can we improve? What are our bottlenecks? All that stuff. So I don't really have a good answer for that. I think the data is like, the jury is in on whether continuous improvement pays off. I think the payoff can be pretty slow and frustrating for the first year.
Right. Well, and this is a terrible paraphrasing of things that you and Devin have said on your podcast, but something along the lines of like, the best improvement is just removal. And like, I feel like that is something that I struggle with. Like, I will also go down, like, I've spent 3 hours thinking while I'm running the machine of like how to improve this. And it's like, or just don't do it. Like, that's the best thing. Like, save all the time.
Totally.
So, yeah, it's tough though. It's really tough.
Yeah. The other big unlock, I think, is in like systems thinking. So there's a saying like, people are operation focused and process blind. So saving time and money in one place can actually cost you a huge amount of time and money somewhere else. And sometimes paradoxically, seeking local efficiency is often not the move. I have a very good example of that from, unfortunately, 2 days ago. There was an incident of reordering the Kanban cards at the CNC to reduce the number of changeovers we had to do, right? So it's like, we have a mix of 6 different products we're going to make, and each one, there's, let's say, 5 orders for each one. So you can do a ton of changeovers and just do one batch of each, or you can just group them all and run a whole bunch, and you don't have to do the changeover, which is about 3 minutes. And so then I came in yesterday to do paint, and I had a lot of one part, but unfortunately the product is made up of 2 parts. And so
oh no,
we didn't have any of the second part. And so it was a great demonstration of like, that was more efficient from the perspective of the CNC operator, right? To reorder those so that there were fewer changeovers. That was undoubtedly more efficient, but it is that global efficiency that we're seeking. And yeah, so anyway.
So you actually brought up an interesting point. How do you deal with your Arda cards internally? Because like, I would imagine you're not scanning and sending yourself an email of like,
not
hey,
yet.
We need more buckles.
Not yet.
Well, yeah. So what's the plan, and how do you how do you deal with internal reordering of your business to business internally to yourself, and what's the recommended workflow there? How do you make it so that you're not just like sending loops of emails to yourself and reading them and, like,
right. And
what do we do there?
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is for every item, you can set an order mechanism. It's like the way that you order the item. And one of the options is internal. And so, rather than, you can print out a QR code, say that can go back into the database, and that'll have notes, that'll have, things like pictures or, an SOP or something like that. But, ultimately, one of the, biggest things you can do is just physically move that card around rather than, scan it and tell someone to do something. And the other thing the system actually really does help with as well is in the color coding. There is a big difference. And I think I finally got Uriel to see the light on color coding like 2
Kyle
weeks
kept
ago.
hammering like, oh, the color coding is amazing. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then we did this implementation where we did tons of cards in like over the course of 3 days. And at one point, it just clicks in your brain where you're just scanning items and you don't have to look at them. You instantly know the category. And that just takes a little bit of repetition. And Kyle was like so in on that from the CRM days. And I was really didn't see the light until now.
Yeah. I created this like system of if for people in hospitals, I would color code them based on department and shade them based on seniority. So like a dark blue person is probably a light blue person's boss, and I know what department that is. And so if I'm just looking at the list of people in who I have in my CRM from that hospital, I can tell who I have in what department, who's boss. It was like just so much information apparent to me at a glance. And it was very, very empowering. With internal Kanban, what we do is we print out the cards with like a color-coded kind of bar at the top and at the bottom as well. For internal ones, that bar is hollow. And so it's just like kind of an outline of a rectangle. And so that can help you at a glance just to determine which are internal, which are external, which you need to move somewhere else, which you need to scan the code for, etc.
Fundamentally, I think there's no difference between ordering. Like fundamentally, an item needs to get supplied by a supplier, and whether that supplier is across the country and owned by someone else, or whether that supplier is internal to your company, the effect is the same, which is like, hey, we need 10 more of these, and please deliver them to this location in this type of bin, right? So you can do all of that. And so the only question then from a practical perspective is sort of like, how are we doing it in our shop? So above, we have essentially 3 Kanban loops in our company. And the goal is to get to 1. I mean, that's everyone's goal, but that might be like a, 50-year goal. But above everywhere that uses supplies that have a Kanban, we have a 2-order bin. So any operator who's using up that supply, anytime they get to a card, they just drop it in there. Once or twice a day, we're collecting those cards. And then depending on the department they're supplied from, they go to different places. And so those cards physically get carried over to that area of the shop. And so if that's the assembly area, that's just going in a bin. For our paint department, we have a 3-week rolling calendar that hangs on the wall that has these little holders for the different cards. And so we're essentially scheduling out our production on that board. That is an unfortunate reality that we are desperately trying to solve, of having a 3-week calendar, because ideally it should be like, a 5-hour lead time. Anytime a card gets triggered, we should be able to deliver the stuff within just a few hours. If you look at like the actual value add time on each part, it's very low. And so that's just a lot of inefficiency that's still in the business that we need to root out. But in the meantime, that's how we're doing it. And so as Kyle said, like the order mechanism for a supply can be email reorders, online reorders, in-person shopping, but it can also just be internal. And then the vendor is the paint department, right? So like we walk that over and reorder it. One big unlock for us in using Arda at Austere is the fact that making and printing order cards is much easier. We are about to basically 4x the number of Kanban cards we're circulating internally. So instead of calling for production of 32, we're about to make a shift to calling for the production of 8 parts from paint. And that is going to, calling for less production is paradoxically probably going to increase the supply, because we are getting closer to making the parts to order. So like as parts are getting used, we're replenishing closer to that supply. And so what happens with big batches is it's actually displacing other things that have been used in that time. And so that's really exciting. And Arda lets you just very quickly go type in 8 instead of 32 and then hit print and print 4 copies instead of 1 copy. We were sort of contemplating that before we started working on this, like handwriting, whatever, I forget how many colors we offer, but it's, it's over 100 cards, and the prospect of handwriting those, you're always like, maybe I'll do it tomorrow. And then tomorrow doesn't come. Yeah.
Right. Is there any kind of dashboard that you can see in Arda? Like if I wanted to see all of the internal reorders in order that they were scanned or whatever, is that something that's possible?
So it's possible to see, like, for instance, your entire process. It's possible to see your entire loop. Tracking like individual scans is also possible from a technical perspective. It's not built out yet. And so what you can do is you can view the way that things normally flow. You can view your value chain. You can view how long it takes you to get from A to B. But yeah, what we don't have is like, okay, my employee scanned this code at this time, and like for this product that I'm holding in my hand right here, this is the path it took specifically. It is doable, I think, from a technical perspective, but not quite there just yet.
Yeah,
I just more meant like if Uriel had 10 reorders internally, if they're all just in a sleeve or something, you're going to have to sit there and like kind of thumb through them versus just having them laid out on a screen of like, okay, here are the 10 cards that were scanned and need to be reordered.
Yeah, I think what's happened is we built this tool and we started about, 6-9 months ago on V1. I would say in the last 2 months, we've really come a long way. And in building out external ordering, we've realized a lot of powerful features that we can do for external ordering. And I think we haven't yet revisited to bring all of those features to internal reordering. But what you're saying is exactly kind of what we'd imagine. That said, the physical cards are a very good way of doing it oftentimes, in that when they get dropped in a bin, we are actually processing them front to back, right? And so the operator should only care about what's in the front. Now, should and does are two different things. There are definitely times when we go looking because of other things, and ideally those things that make us look through them get flagged as possible improvements. Like one example is we used to, we would go to manufacture something and then realize the gripper fingers for running the parts on the CNC were damaged. And so we'd have to sort of we'd rearrange those Kanbans because we couldn't produce the thing that it was telling us to produce. Since then, we've now added Kanbans to the 3D printed gripper finger jaws. So now we have a backup pair right there. And then when that gets pulled, that triggers production on our 3D printer. And so that sort of like points to maybe the most overlooked and powerful feature of Kanban, which is highlighting inefficiency and highlighting breakdowns in your system. But yeah, that's kind of
that's almost like with the question of like where to stop or when does it become too much. I mean, yesterday we were having this conversation about like single piece flow and internally like what that would look like in my kitchen with like cooking a steak. I was like, am I really supposed to take one, like chop, clean the knife, cook that piece of meat, eat that piece of meat, digest, swallow, right? And like actually the answer is yes, there is no hypothetical maximum. Ideally, that would be the best state to do it in, because I'd probably become a vegetarian and realize that, yeah, I don't want to eat raw meat. And so cooking meat like in this way is really time consuming. And if I didn't have a system that highlighted how time consuming it is for me to actually, do it, I probably wouldn't realize that being a vegetarian would be a better, cheaper, more efficient, et cetera, option, right? And so it's like, even if you are like living in the waste, you're like thinking about the waste in a way.
So going back to your grippers really quick, can you have time-based Kanbans? Like, could you just say, like, these grippers have been used for 3 weeks, they need to be replaced prematurely and just have that Kanban trigger automatically?
Again, I think could, yes, for sure. I don't think that's a thing we have built out quite yet, but we just created order groups, which with a click of a button, you can add a whole bunch of things to the cart. And the place that immediately made, we did that for a customer. And the thing it made me immediately think of is like servicing my air compressor, right? It's like once a year, I need like an air filter, like some crush washer or whatever, right? Like a list of things. And I never remember a year later what the exact list was. And so I thought building those out would be really nice. And that immediately also brings up the sort of like time-based activities of, generally maintenance is a big one, wear items. And so I could imagine doing it. And this is just like to be candid here. The real thing that we keep sort of laughing about is like, it is so easy for this to become bloated and complicated. And it is so hard to keep it really, really simple. And so that's sort of the balance.
It's so hard to keep it simple.
Yeah. And so the other thing is like, even already we've added so many features that, again, you do not have to use them. But I think in demoing it, the more features we sort of throw at people, they sort of like their eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, we don't need all of that. And it's like, sure, then don't use all of that.
Don't use it then.
Yeah. But like, it's just like overwhelming. And they're like, oh, that sort of just way more than we need right now. And anyway, so it's sort of like simple when you want it and powerful where you need it is the way we're thinking about it. But it is a real challenge to keep it from getting bloated and cumbersome to use.
Yeah, totally. The phrase we keep throwing back and forth is, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. And I feel like that's like our product development. Like we keep making it complicated. Then Uriel uses it as like, here's all the reasons that doesn't work. And then we make it a lot simpler.
That's fair. That's totally fair. Last question from listeners. Murph's Machine asked, lowest hanging fruit for lean at a medium-sized shop. And I would imagine the obvious answer is Kanban cards, but maybe outside obviously Arda first, and then
definitely
what's the next
Arda
lowest hanging fruit?
So there's a lot of different entry points that I've seen companies take to lean. I would say it depends on the company a little bit, because I think the real challenge is buy-in. You need people to be excited about doing the thing, and making that a top-down, like, hey, we came into the shop and threw away all of your unnecessary, quote-unquote, unnecessary tools. Like, that's not going to get you buy-in, right? And I think there's sort of a long history of contentiousness between labor and management in this country, where it's sort of, there's a call from management to become more efficient. And then if you do that, it's like, okay, great. Like, now be more efficient. And we're not going to pay you anymore. So I think you need to definitely establish a lot of trust there that makes it clear that you are genuinely interested in improving people's job, right? Like, not time, not going faster, not increasing production. Like, the focus is, hey, you know how you have to bend over and pick up that heavy thing 3 times a day? What if you didn't have to, There's a funny example in a book by Eliyahu Goldratt of a company that was having tremendous problems moving materials around. So like a line would be ready to start, but they wouldn't have product there. And the reason was they only had, they didn't have space for enough forklifts. So they had like 1 or 2 forklifts that were moving product from line to line. And so if you just got the timing wrong, you'd be waiting while they're doing a different material reshuffling. And then they went in and looked at it, and there was absolutely no reason to load the product into heavy totes. You could just load the product into 30-pound totes, and then people could just carry it around. And so that was the move there. And it turns out that there's a lot of frustration on the production line or on the shop floor in sort of a breakdown of communication and a lack of trust from management. And so what we've seen even in implementing Arda for companies is that there's a lot of people on the shop floor are not grateful, that's the wrong word. They're just like, yeah, okay, great. Now, like they appreciate being empowered to tell people when stuff needs to be ordered, because they catch flack for not delivering stuff on time, right? It's like, hey, why isn't this thing built and ready for delivery? And you're like, well, you got me the stuff 5 days late, but that's sort of forgotten when you're 3 weeks later. And so they just appreciate, because there's a lot of frustration going to your manager and saying like, hey, did you order that thing yet? Did you order that thing? And so I think the entry point is going to always be whatever thing gets you buy-in from everyone in the company. And it's not going to be everyone, but from a majority of people. So genuinely trying to solve people's problems so to improve their quality of life is the move. And there's that saying like slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I mean, it's not dumb, but it sort of doesn't make sense, but it turns out to be pretty much true, right? Like you can be moving fast. This is sort of like operations versus process. You can have really the appearance of speed, but then everything is so precarious that when something breaks, you end up eating up all the time you saved. And so, yeah, I think like you can afford to not focus on speed and not focus on profits, but instead focus on improving people's quality of life, and the rest of it does come. Especially when, we just had this, I would say, in the last 6 months, the big breakthrough of like everyone in the business starting to come up with like really good improvements. And some of those improvements, I mean, the other day, the improvement was adding 4 pieces of yellow electrical tape next to our oven to designate exactly what was in each slot in the oven and previously, and you just get used to these things. Previously, we would always walk by, open the oven, sort of look in the oven, look at our Kanban cards, figure out which item was which, and then close the oven and keep going, right? It was like, wait, what if we just designated it? So yeah, that is huge. Speaking of high leverage activities, like teaching everyone to start thinking about how to make their life easier around the shop is huge.
I dig it. Yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to shop news and new things. Anything new going on in Arda? I know you had released V3, I think, when we spoke the first time. So any new things coming soon to it, or are you just kind of working through V3?
Well, we're fully on V4 right now, like officially for sure.
Oh,
and
So that's a new thing.
And honestly, I think we're probably close-ish to V5. It's funny, Uriel mentioned earlier that like and this is a conclusion that I came to when I'm in my private equity field evaluated a low-code, no-code platform for acquisition, is there's no such thing as low-code, no-code, just less code. And ultimately, the more fleshed out a lot of these features become, the kind of faster the platform is getting, which sounds counterintuitive, but it's just because ultimately you're just writing more code, getting, past some of the low code, no code UI stuff, and that's taking less processing power. And so that's been, I think, a pretty big unlock, I think, for me on the kind of product development side, is sort of, continuing to push the product past, I don't know. Yeah. Some of the performance limits that low code, no code platforms can impose on you.
There's a bunch of new features in Arda. We sort of talked about this, and this isn't super new, but adding images to the cards is huge. At a glance, instead of having to read, you just look at it and you know exactly what it's for. Turns out like humans have a pretty badass visual cortex in our brains, and sometimes we forget to use it. I'm a slow reader, but even for really fast readers, they're not nearly as fast as like just looking and like image recognition. So that is awesome. We are offering on-site implementations, and that's been really fun. Super interesting to be on the shop floor, help people just kind of get up the hill so that they can start seeing value from it quicker. Companies that are trying to grow fast and don't have their inventory figured out, often the one thing they do not have is a lot of extra bandwidth to sort of like implement a new system. And so they've been happy to kind of just bring us in, and some of it's pretty simple, but some of it is useful to have some years of actually like practically implementing order cards. Like, do we want to do a 2-bin system? Do we want to Like, how are we storing the cards in this physical workspace, building different infrastructure to just make like using the product really quick and easy, finding the product really quick and easy, reordering the product needs to be quick and easy, and also replenishing the product needs to be quick and easy. So, having bins, like one of the things we saw a lot was ordering smaller quantities so that it would immediately drop onto the shelf where you're going to use it, where a lot of companies end up for no good reason. Like, there's literally no savings in shipping. There's no savings in bulk discounts. They're just ordering a lot because they hate reordering the thing. Basically what it comes down to. So just dropping that down so you can tuck it onto a shelf. I'm kind of off topic of new things, but the images have been really good. The on-site implementations have been really fun. Other new things we've done.
And there are a lot of like really
cool features.
Smaller things. Yeah. So for instance, like including items in the receiving workflow, really kind of nailing that color coding so that, the bars are hollow for internal things. We recently added a value chain like feature. And so one of the things we realized is that when you place orders through the platform and then receive orders through the platform, we know what your lead times are. And so we can calculate how long it took you to get something. And if you map out your value chain, we just added a functionality where you can create a precedent item, like a preceding item in the process. So for instance, Uriel turns aluminum into, unpainted buckle like parts, right? And then they get painted, and then they're the black or yellow buckle parts, right? And so you can see how long that process takes and map things out that way. Also added the ability to create packing lists. And so part of that was the precedent item. So if I'm ordering from somebody, like I take an item, I take aluminum, turn it into X, and I send X off to another company A to do something to it, and it comes back to me as Y.
For example.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the, yeah. I knew there was a word that I was forgetting, and I appreciate you jumping in with it. So yeah. Yeah. And then you get anodized parts back, right? So if I'm ordering anodized parts, I need to have a concept in the system of, hey, this is the part that comes before it in the value chain. So we just added that. And then the big things we're working on are QuickBooks integration, PO generation, and something else that I'm forgetting. But yeah, just a couple of like business things like allowing people to spin up instances without kind of our intervention.
Like trying to make some of the lower tiers more self-serve.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that brings me then to the last two questions I ask every guest every week. First up, what did you research this week? Doesn't have to be manufacturing or lean related. It's just cool to see what interesting people are interested in.
Yeah, a couple things. So related to the product, this sounds really in the weeds, but I wanted to be able to get all of our action buttons into one column where they're just represented by an icon. And so I figured out a way to do that on the not, product related side. I've just been consuming a ton of like Lord of the Rings content. Just a lot. Very interesting. There's a lot there.
Awesome.
For me, I've been researching plan for every part, PFEP. That's more on the lean side. And that is honestly sounds fancy. It's the natural conclusion of Kanban, where you're basically putting in all the information about a part because you actually want a real plan for it. And it's actually been really interesting looking at my business in relation to that concept, because I'm realizing that we don't have a plan for every part. And there's actually a ton of parts where it's just being improvised all the time. And that could be returns, right? Like someone got the wrong, we shipped them the wrong thing. They send it back. Where does that go, right? Do we have a receiving bin we don't have any specified process for that. But also when you order parts, you know how much space they're going to take up. Do you have enough space designated on your shelf for that item to come in and just immediately land on your shelf? The answer is oftentimes no. And so just, it's so funny. Like once you see it, you're like, wow, this is so easily solved. So now I've been resizing a lot of our Kanbans so that the reorder quantity is the exact amount that will fit in the bin that I have, which sounds obvious, but just making that plan is just saves a ton of time and just creates a lot of simplicity and ease of, I don't know, just doing the work. On a separate note, been researching printers a lot. We are thinking about offering a service where we print people's cards on, from a very expensive printer, but on really nice media that's just really quick. So, been looking into a lot of different printing technologies. They all sort of have their pros and cons, unsurprisingly. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't exist. But it's been an interesting, so like, I don't know, dye sublimation is used a lot in photography, like photograph printers. And those are full color, obviously. And then it made me wonder, the cost is very similar to inkjet. And so is it just about media that is the reason they both exist? Is it something else? I don't really know. If anyone is listening, knows a lot about the different printing technologies and wanted to pick them, please do reach out. So that's very active. And yeah, that's kind of what I've been researching. How about you? What have you been researching? Is this allowed?
Oh yeah, of course. A lot of machining stuff. Like we got the 5-axis, so I've just been doing a ton of like programming and testing. And
very cool.
Things like that. I mentioned on the last one, LED retrofits for all of our fluorescents. I bought those, so I've been, waiting on that so I can start doing all that. Not a lot of like new research though. It's just kind of, we're a little overwhelmed with orders right now. And so it's just anything and everything I can do to make things work is what I'm researching.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah. Well, the last question then, I ask every guest, what are the things you're working on to be a better person, leader, employer, what have you? None of us are perfect. We're all working on stuff. What are you working on?
One of the, I kind of looked at my bookshelf, and I recently picked back up this book called Never Split the Difference, which Uriel's heard me talk about a bunch, but it's a negotiation book written by like an FBI hostage negotiator. And it informs my daily life. And I've read it, and it just blew me away, the many ways in which we could communicate with intention. And like communicate tactically, like with an outcome in mind, and really just like make the world a better place. It sounds like almost manipulative, but it's really not. It's just this idea of, hey, how do I communicate effectively what I'm actually trying to say, and how do I begin with the end in mind rather than communicate maybe emotionally or impulsively? And I kind of, every time I go down that journey, I feel like there's just more there, and it's something I can always be better at, and just achieves really, really high yields. Is just communicating with a deep, deep intention.
That's a good one. I've been meaning to read that book.
Can't recommend highly enough. Seriously.
I am on my second read through of Super Communicators. I can't decide if it's exactly the opposite of what you just said, but it's probably not. It's also communicating with intention, but it is very much sort of the idea of developing deeper relationships with people, and has a lot of really interesting studies around engendering closeness, and a lot of it is sort of more about communicating emotions, because it actually turns out that that's a lot of what, like, you've probably seen it on forums. There's sort of like the 30 questions for falling in love in 5 minutes or something. I feel like that goes around every few years. That started as a research question of like, how would we proactively engender closeness? Most of the participants don't fall in love. I think it was one, but a lot of them did end up being really close friends. So that's been really interesting, and definitely made me think a lot about how I communicate. And even if it's just becoming a better conversationalist, so you're not having boring conversations. So that's been fun. And then the other is becoming more organized and developing a plan for every task. So, just getting better at using to-do lists and being diligent about not putting stuff on the to-do list that doesn't actually have to get done, and also better about getting stuff done that is on there. Trying to re-implement a real adherence to my calendar and just get a lot of that stuff out of my head. So, yeah.
Awesome. So big theme of communication. I appreciate that from two different angles. And I mean, I think that that's super important in business, both engendering closeness, even if it's artificially with the people you interact with, and, learning how to communicate so you can get what you want. Both of those are incredibly important.
Yeah. A lot of the examples were actually in a sales context. So, definitely very applicable. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure we've all had salesmen that we immediately identify with and love having in our shop. And then there's ones that you're like, oh, can you just leave right now? Like, I know you've taken one step in, but we're done here. I'm not buying what you're selling. So yeah, I think that's super important. Well, guys, please let us know where we can go to find out more, or if they want to schedule a demo, all that stuff. Give us all your details.
Totally. So you can find us at Arda, ARDA.cards, CARDS. It's our website. You can reach out to us at Kyle at Arda.cards. And then Uriel, you want to give your info on Austere as well?
Well, you can reach me at Uriel at Arda.cards. Do check out our website. If you are interested in becoming a guinea pig for a self-serve workflow, we'd definitely love to hear from you. Your patience with our systems will be rewarded. And you can reach me on Instagram. Oh yeah, Instagram is Austere_manufacturing. And then we also spun one up for Arda. So that's Arda.cards on Instagram. We would love to hear any feedback on content that you guys would like to see. So whether we have a video, our most popular video is about 2-bin systems. I thought it would be a little too in the weeds. Turns out people like in the weeds. And then website is austeremfg.com.
And last thing is, if you want to check out a demo of Arda.cards, you can just go to demo.arda.cards and just play around with our demo environment. You can create cards for free, print them, mess around, and any feedback you have on that would be great.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks to the Patreon members who make the show possible. Shuvo, a new patron member, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening, and I will be back next week.